Trickling in, let me welcome you all to this special session on Tajikistan, an online event sponsored by the Asian Studies Center at St. Anthony's College, Oxford. It's a pleasure to have our four speakers with us today, and I shall introduce them very soon. Before doing so, I just want to lay out the procedure for this event. So we will conduct it as a conversation and then open up to questions from the audience. And depending on your preference, you can write in your questions anonymously in the Q&A box, and someone will read them out. I imagine you can write them in Tajik or Russian. English is the language I will be reading out in. Or you can raise your hand function and appear on screen to speak. And we have a professional translator here as well. So feel free to ask your questions in a language that is comprehensible to the person you're asking that question to. So that is as far as the procedure is concerned. This event is being recorded and it will be available online. So if you do not want to be identified, please make sure that when you write in your questions, do so under the designation anonymous, and you don't have to introduce yourself if you're asking verbally or on screen. So with that, let me begin with the introductions. We have with us a really wonderful, stellar panel of experts on Tajikistan and on various regions within it. So to begin with, we have Mr. Muhyiddin Kabiri, who is chairman of the National Alliance of Tajikistan and chairman of the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, the main opposition party in the country. We also have Alim Sherzamanov, also an opposition politician. From that part of Tajikistan, we shall be discussing in particular the province of Gorno-Badakhshan, which has gone under a government clampdown over the last few weeks. We also have from the United States two experts. We have Dr. Suzanne Levy-Sanchez, who is a non-resident fellow, School of International Service at the American University, and retired with tenure associate professor at the US Naval War College, and Dr. Edward Lemon, research assistant professor at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. And our panelists have various levels and kinds of expertise, both in terms of Tajikistan as a country and, as I said, on its specific regions. So before turning to the conversation, what I want to do for those who may not know the country or the region well is to just start off with a short introduction. Tajikistan came out of the collapse of the Soviet Union in a very brutal way, because it came out through the process of civil war, a very destructive, violent civil war, which came to an end in the late 1990s when I first started going to the country. And it came to an end in a negotiated settlement, which, as far as I can tell, left the old regime in power. Since then, and I would imagine at least since 9/11 and the war on terror, at which point democratization was put off the table and authoritarian states had more, as it were, room for maneuver, you have the Tajik state, as it were, trying to regain its or consolidate its power over the whole country. And one of the places this happens is the apparently or ostensibly autonomous province of Gorno-Badakhshan, the largest province in the country, but very sparsely populated, with a very sensitive border with Afghanistan. And there have been several instances of government clampdowns, including the one that is in progress now And so we want to discuss both what is happening there and place that contemporary current struggle within the larger context of post-Civil War politics in Tajikistan. So let me begin then with Mohideen Kabiri. If you could tell us something about your role and the role of the opposition in Tajikistan since the Civil War.
سلامت باشید فیصل دوستان عزیز به نام خداوند بخشنده و مهربان با اجازه مدیر این جلسه من با زبان تاجیکی صحبت میکنم چون ایشان در اول صحبت گفتند که اکثریت شرکت کنندگان این نشست هم تاجیکی رو میفهمند و هم اکثریت تاجیک هستند و اینچنین همزمان یک مترجمی به زبان انگلیسی وجود دارد. از من خواهش شد که درباره وضع عمومی تاجیکستان در آغاز صحبت کنم و اینچنین نقش اپوزیسیا از بعد از امضای سازشنامه صلح تا حالا از کجا شروع کردن و به کجا رسیدن. من چند نکته رو میخواستم در آغاز بگویم و قبل از آن که به نقش یا به جایگاه اپوزیسیا وارد شویم. نکته اول این است که اگر ما و شما با تمام سندهای امضا شده بین تاجیکان در زمان صلح و حتی به خود کنستیتوسیا که سال 1994 پیش از امضای سازشنامه حتی و بدون اشتراک اپوزیسیا قبول شده بود، اگر نگاه کنیم در اون یک مفهوم اساسی وجود دارد که تاجیکستان یک دولت دموکراتی، حقوق بنیاد و گوناگون اندیش باید باشد و این پرینسیپ یا این اصل هم در کنستیتوسیا هست، هم در سازشنامه عمومی صلح، هم در تمام پروتکل ها، دکلاراسیون ها، بیانات های طرف های صلح هست و طبق این سندها و این بیانیه ها باید که تاجیکستان امروز در بین کشورهای دموکراتی پیشرفته و کشور حقوق بنیاد می بود که در آن قانون از طرف حاکمیت و از طرف مردم احترام می شود و رعایت می شود. اما سوال این است که امروز ما در کجا قرار داریم؟ آیا واقعا چنین هست که آن چیزی که ما می‌خواستیم و در کنستیتوسیا، در سازشنامه صلح، در دیگر سندها ثبت کردیم، آیا در همون نقطه هستیم یا یک تاجیکستان دیگر داریم؟ و اگر به گزارش‌های سازمان‌های بین‌المللی نگاه کنیم، تاجیکستان از جمله 10 کشوری از همه بسته‌ترین، یعنی افطری‌ترین، فساد زده و قشاق دنیا میباشد. و سوال با وجود میآید که چرا چنین شد؟ در اینجا کی گناهکار است؟ عامل‌های اصلی چی بود؟ و همونطور که فیصل هم سوال داد که نقش اپوزیسیا در اینجا چگونه بود و ما اگر این عامل‌ها رو همش رو علاهیده و خیلی وسیع تحلیل کنیم، یقین هست عمیق است که این یک صحبت 10-15 دقیقه کافی نخواهد بود. بنابراین من در چند نکته اساسی اشاره خواهم کرد که برای چی از نگاه ما چنین شد که حکومت در اینجا چی نقش داشت و اپوزیسیا چی نقش داشت. از نگاه من در اینجا مشکلی نه در کنستیتوسیا هست، نه در سازشنامه، نه در دیگر بیانیه‌ها و قانون‌ها، بلکه مشکلی در آن است که شخص اولی که طبق کنستیتوسیا و طبق قانونگذاری کشور بالاترین مقام کشور را داشت، یعنی پرزیدنت تاجیکستان جناب امام رحمان، نه خواهش و نه اراده تطبیق کنستیتوسیا و تطبیق طلبات سازشنامه صلح و دیگر سندها را نداشت. برای چی نداشت؟ اینجا سوال کلیدی هم همین است که برای چی امام رحمان نخواست که این معیارهایی که در کنستیتوسیا و در سازشنامه صلح بین طرف‌ها ثبت شده بود رعایت شود؟ برای اینکه معنای این تطبیق سازشنامه و تطبیق کنستیتوسیا نتیجهش آن میشد که او باید از قدرت برود. هم طبق کنستیتوسیا سال 1994 او دیگر حقی در قدرت باقی ماندن نداشت و هم طبق سازشنامه صلح او باید بعد 7 ساله از قدرت میرفت. و این نکته خیلی کلیدی هست و امام رحمان واقعا بین یک انتخاب دشوار بود باید که یا کنستیتوسیون رو انتخاب میکرد و سازشنامه صلح را و آینده تاجیکستان رو که یک کشوری دموکراتی و حقوق بنیاد خواهد بود، برای آنکه پرزیدنت عمل کننده از قدرت برای مصالحت آمیز و طبق قانون و طبق سازشنامه رفت. نفری بعدی هم که پرزیدنت می بود از آن طلب کرده میشد که مثل امام علی رحمان باید با طلبات قانون از قدرت برود. اما امام علی رحمان یک راه دیگر هم داشت غیر از اینکه از قدرت برود طبق کنستیتوسیون و سازشنامه. راه دیگر این که کنستیتوسیون و سازشنامه صلح و دیگر سندها را پامال کند، نادیده بگیرد یا تغییر بدهد و اپوزیسیون را از قدرت از صحنه نابود کند، رسانه‌های مستقل را و یک نظام رپرسیوی اتوریتری را در کشور جاری کند تا اینکه بتواند این ادامه قدرتش در تاجیکستان را داشته باشد. و من فکر میکنم که در این انتخاب خیلی دشوار جناب امام علی رحمان راه دیوم را انتخاب کرد، راهی که خودش در قدرت باید باقی بماند و کنستیتوسیون، سازشنامه صلح و آینده کشور را در زیر سوال برد. و آن چیزی که ما امروز داریم در تاجیکستان این انتخاب رحمان است، نه انتخاب مردم است، نه انتخاب مردم تاجیکستان که هیچ وقت نمیخواهد که یک کشوری به این مانند داشته باشد که از همه قشاق، از همه عقب مانده. حالا در یک گوشه تاجیکستان اینترنت نیست، در یک گوشه دیگرش برق نیست، همیشه یک حالت امنیتی و جنگ هست، مردم 2 میلیون از قوه کاری در خارج کشور هست، مردم که حتما این رو نمیخواست و قانون هم این رو طلب نمیکرد، سازشنامه صلح هم این رو در نظر نگرفته بود. اما یگانه کسی که در این وضعیت منفیت دار بود این خود پرزیدنت امام علی رحمان بود و یک اطرافیان خیلی هم محدود و خوب که قدرت رو در دست دارند. و او در این راه 3 etape رو 3 مرحله رو انتخاب کرد. یکم وقتی که لازم شد صلح کرد. اصلا خود صلح به خاطر آن بود که امام علی رحمان قدرت رو میتوانست از دست بدهد، زیرا که نیروهای پیشصف اپوزیسیون در اطراف دوشنبه بودند. روسیه هم کمک منبعدی خودش رو به تاجیکستان با شروع گفت و شنیدها مربوط دانسته بود، شرط گذاشته بود و از همه مهمش مردم تاجیکستان از جنگ خسته شده بودند و طلبگار صلحی بیچون چرا با اپوزیسیون بودند. و امام علی رحمان هم به نظر من انتخابش درست بود که باید صلح کند، اگرچه در اول قدرتش گفته بود که من هیچگاه با این اپوزیسیون صلح نخواهم کرد. و صلح با اپوزیسیون امکان داد که قدرت را حفظ کند وگرنه از دست میداد. اتاپ دیوم یا مرحله دیوم این تا سالهای 2010 هست، یعنی بعد از امضای سازشنامه تا سال 2010 در اینجا امام علی رحمان چند خواهد یا به اصطلاح حرکتی خیلی هم جدی کرد که اپوزیسیون و مردم رو در برابر یک انتخاب دشوار گذاشت. برای مثال وقتی که رفراندوم اول راه اندازی کرد، در اونجا هم مهلت پرزیدنتی خود را تمدید کردن شد و هم باید که فعالیت حزب دینی در سال 2015 نه در همون سال باید که طبق رفراندومی که رحمان میخواست عملی کند باید قطع میشد و اپوزیسیون در یک حالت دشوار قرار داشت. اگر با رحمان وارد گفتگو نشود و عقب نشینی نکند میتواند در کشور از نو جنگ شروع شود، برای آنکه وضعیت به همون سمت میرفت و امام علی رحمان هم خوب میدونست که اپوزیسیون برای گفت و شنید برای گذشت کردن آماده است. چرا؟ برای اینکه هدف استراتژی اپوزیسیون تاجیک این ثبات آرامش در تاجیکستان و راه انداختن به جنگ نوبتی بود و این رو امام علی رحمان خوب میدونست و خوب هم استفاده کرد و نتیجه این شد که بعد گفت و شنیدها امام علی رحمان از متن لایحه رفراندوم مسئله حزب نهضت اسلامی تاجیکستان رو بیرون برآورد و حزب نهضت اپوزیسیون در عموم راضی شدند که باز امام علی رحمان یک 7 سال دیگر هم در قدرت باقی بماند که این برخلاف سازشنامه صلح و کنستیتوسیون قبلی بود. و اپوزیسیون در عوض یک فعالیت 7 ساله دیگر یا انیخترش در عوض دادن یک مهلت 7 ساله دیگر به رحمانوف همچون پرزیدنت برای خودش هم یک مدت 7 تا 10 سال دیگر رو در چارچوب قانون عمل کردن رو خرید بیرون. و ولی معلوم بود که این 7 سالی که به امام رحمان داده می شود طبق این سازشنامه با اپوزیسیا برای تمرکز قدرت در دست خودش استفاده خواهد شد، برای زدن باز هم خودی اپوزیسیا از بر مورد رسانه ها و غیره که این کار رو در مرحله دیوم انجام داد و تا سال 2010 قدرت رو در دست خود حفظ کرد و تمام شاخه‌های حاکمیت رو در تابعیت خود درآورد و از سال بعد از انتخابات پارلمانی 2010 با قبول پروتکل 3220 در آخر سال 2011 شروع کرد به سرکوب کردن اپوزیسیا، رسانه‌ها، جامعه شهروندی و زمینه رو آماده کرد برای اتاپ سیوم، مرحله سیوم که این اعلام کردن خود پیشروی ملت، از بین بردن اپوزیسیا و به خارجه یا به زندان روانه کردن آنها و مادام العمر یا تا آخر حیات گرداندن حاکمیت در تاجیکستان برای خود و برای فرزندانش. اگر ما این 3 اتاپ رو پهلوی هم بگذاریم و تحلیل کنیم، بعد درک خواهیم کرد که چرا در امروز در بدخشان برای مثال وضعیت این گونه است. تا اون وقت تا سال 2011-12 امام رحمان اصلا به منطقه کار نداشت، چون هدف او بیشتر اپوزیسیا در دوشنبه بود، اپوزیسیا سیاسی، مسجدها، سازمانهای دینی و به خصوص شخصیت‌های سطح ملی، حالا فرق ندارد که اعضای حزب بود یا یگان غیر حزبی، آنها را هم هدف قرار داد. وقتی آنها از بین برده شدن یا ضعیف شدن، شروع کرد به منطقه ها و به خصوص به منطقه بدخشان، برای آنکه منطقه بدخشان هم طبق کنستیتوسیا یک منطقه اتونومی هست، ولایت اتونومی، و هم دارای فرهنگ، خصوصیت‌های فرهنگی و زبانی خودش است و از همه مهم مردم بدخشان همیشه تلاش کردن و امروز هم تلاش کرده ایستادن که اون حق دیگر بودن خود را حفظ کنند. و برای امام رحمان این مسئله خیلی مسئله کلیدی بود، چون که همچون پیشوا، همچون یک نفری که تمام تاجیکستان رو باید در اختیار، در کنترل داشته باشد، اصلا قابل قبول نیست. در فهمیش اون نمی‌گنجد که یک منطقه تاجیکستان بگوید که نه میبخشید من دیگر هستم، من دیگر بودن میخوام، فرهنگ من، بله من تاجیکستانم، جزی تاجیکستانم، تاجیکستانی هستم، اما فرهنگم، زبانم، فهمیشم، رسم و آیین‌هایم کمتر فرق میکنند. از همه مهم استاتوسی من در کنستیتوسیا از دیگر منطقه فرق میکنند. برای امام رحمان این قابل قبول نبود و همیشه تلاششان برای آنکه باید که این خواسته خود را چقدر که در کلاب و سوق و دوشنبه و منطقه‌های دیگر ختلان عملی کرد، در بدخشان هم 100% عملی کند و یگانه خواسته امام رحمان از بدخشان هم این است که مثل منطقه‌های دیگر باشد، که طبیعی است که این کار شدنی نیست و بدخشان هم تا فکر میکنم تا آخر مبارزه خواهد بود تا اینکه حق دیگر بودن را از دست ندهد و در داخل تاجیکستان دیگر باشد. من فکر میکنم که حالا چون صحبت طولانی نشود، دیگر دوستان رو هم بشنویم، فکر میکنم که تا روزی که امام رحمان در قدرت هست این گونه مناسبت با بدخشان باقی خواهد ماند و بدخشان هم این تلاش‌های خود را برای دیگر بودن و اون استاتوس خیلی هم اونیکالی اتونومی را برای حفظ کردنش تلاش خواهد کرد و ما این وضعیت رو در داخل کشور تا آخر خواهیم داشت. تشکر. من اینجا صحبت خود را به انجام رسوندم.
خیلی ممنون آقای کبیری. Ed, can I turn to you? Obviously, we cannot translate the entirety of what Mr. Kabiri has just said, but he has gone through the history of the civil and post-civil war dispensation in Tajikistan, noted the role of its president in resiling from his democratic commitments, in conditions where large numbers of Tajik citizens have to be outside the country, economic crisis, and then the clampdowns in different parts of the country. So Ed, I wonder if you could pick up on some of these themes and give us your reactions to them.
Sure, well, thank you, and welcome everyone who's here with us today. So I will not translate what Mr. Kabiri has said, but I will make a very similar comments and talk about how we have got to the situation we're in 30 years after Tajikistan's independence. We have a country that remains the poorest in Central Asia. In fact, GDP per capita with a rising population and stagnating incomes is actually at a 10-year low, or reached a 10-year low during the pandemic in 2020. We have a president who's ruled the country since 1992, Emomali Rahmon, the longest serving president in the former Soviet Union. We have over 1 million plus citizens living outside the country, mostly migrant seasonal laborers working in Russia, Turkey, elsewhere. And we have one of the most migration dependent countries in the world. We have a regime that rules using repression, a highly authoritarian regime, and a highly corrupt and kleptocratic regime. The president has 9 children, and various others have married into his extended family, and they've carved up large swathes of the economy, along with dominating the political situation in the country. His daughter is his chief of staff. His son and supposed heir, Rustam, is the mayor of the capital city, Dushanbe, and also was elected in 2020 to be speaker of the parliament, which means that he, should his father become incapacitated, would step into the role of the presidency. So according to the constitution, he is next in line to rule the country. And we're seeing an attempted transition of power from father to son to keep this kleptocratic system that's controlled by the family. So how did we get here? To summarize what Mr. Kabiri has just said, Tajikistan, of course, was the only country in the region to experience civil war after gaining independence 30 years ago. Without going into the complexities and details of that conflict, I think it's important to remember that this conflict came to an end by a negotiated settlement between both the current government and president and the opposition. They came together with the support of external partners, and they negotiated a settlement to this conflict, by which the opposition were allocated 30% of the posts within the government. The Islamic Renaissance Party, of which Mr. Kabiri is leader, was legalized in 1999, and then from 2000 till 2015 was elected to parliament and had 2 deputies that at least signaled that there was some sort of signaling that reconciliation and peace building had taken place. But as Mr. Kabiri explained, over the past, since the end of the Cold War, which anniversary will, or end of the Civil War, sorry, which anniversary will come next year, or later this year, sorry, we've seen Emomali Rahmon gradually consolidating his power. We've seen him targeting the various warlords that put him into power at the height of the Civil War. We've seen him gradually trying to take control of different parts of the country that were outside of his control, such as the Rasht Valley and also Badakhshan, that I think the next 2 speakers will dwell on. And at the same time, we've seen him eventually cracking down on the opposition. We have evidence from something called Protocol 3220 that the security services had a plan, the government had a plan to eventually marginalize and ban the opposition party, which they achieved in 2015, blaming it for a supposed coup attempt and labeling it a terrorist organization, arresting many of the leading members and forcing others into exile. So by 2015, we had the end of the post-reconciliation period in the country. At the same time, we had the president himself changing the constitution and becoming a leader of the nation, legally immune, president for life, and able to control the country even after he leaves, supposedly, or potentially leaves the presidency. He would still retain that role of leader of the nation. Of course, we've seen in Kazakhstan how that transition hasn't worked out so well, but I think if he can firmly place his son in power, then he will be more assured that his elite will stay within power. So through these various methods of combining repression against elite members of the elite, purging the opposition from the country, and promoting his own allies, he's managed to consolidate his power within the country over the past, certainly over the past 25 years at this point. And we've ended up with a situation where we have a very authoritarian country, and ultimately the needs of the people of Tajikistan are in many cases not being met. But with that, I will finish and hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Ed. There's a lot, obviously, that can be said about the sort of the larger issues at play here in the country as a whole. But I'm glad you brought up Kazakhstan, because, of course, what's happening right now before our very eyes is the absorption of what appeared initially to be a kind of separate Tajik situation into a much larger set of conflicts and crises that include Kazakhstan, certainly, but also to some degree Ukraine in the post-Soviet space. And it'll be interesting to see, how these two other conflicts tell upon what's happening in Tajikistan and sort of policy directed towards it, both by great powers, Russia in the immediate neighborhood, and the United States and the EU, and perhaps smaller countries like Turkey. But we'll come back to that. I want to go now to Mr. Sherzamanov to tell us something at first, what's happening now in Khorog and in the rest of Badakhshan. And then perhaps you might link what's happening now to earlier instances in which the government has clamped down on that region and the justification it has given for these clampdowns and what you think of that justification. So when Mr. Sherzamanov speaks, he will speak in maybe a couple of sentences and the translator will then translate directly. Okay? Yes, Mr. Sherzamanov?
Предоставленное слово. Я, наверное, буду говорить и останавливаться, чтобы переводили. У меня очень короткая будет речь.
Thank you very much, Mr. Faisal. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I will try to be as brief as possible.
Я начну с самого свежего случая. 25 ноября 2021 года с жестоким убийством 29-летнего Гульбедина Зиубекова и последующим затем убийством еще двоих молодых людей Тутишова Миршоева и Гулназара Муродбекова спецгруппа Альфа ГКНБ-РТ спровоцировала очередную конфронтацию между центральной властью и населением Бадахшанской автономии на востоке Таджикистана.
Probably I will start from the most recent case, which took place on the 25th of November 2021, when with the brutal murder of a 29-year-old Gulbuddin Ziobekov and subsequent killing of two other young men, Tutishova Mirshoev and Gulnazar Murodbekov, by the special unit of Alpha that belongs to the Tajik KGB, which basically provoked another confrontation between the central government and the population of Badakhshan autonomy in the eastern Tajikistan.
После подписания мирного соглашения в 1997 году, это уже пятая или шестая акция устрашения со стороны Душанбе, этого этнического и конфессионального меньшинства. После убийства молодых людей народ вместе с телами погибших вышел на центральную площадь города на акцию протеста. К сожалению, со стороны силовиков опять была расстреляна эта акция, и 17 человек получили ранения, из которых трое сегодня находятся, трое стали калеками на всю жизнь.
This was probably the fifth or the sixth act of intimidation by Dushanbe against the ethnic and confessional indigenous minorities since the peace agreement in 1997 was signed. And after the execution of the young man, people took their bodies to the central square in Khorog, demanding that those who were responsible for their murder would be brought into justice, but regrettably, the peaceful protests were also fired upon by the security forces, resulting in 17 people injured, 3 of whom beared severe injuries and left with permanent physical disabilities.
После 4-дневной акции протеста власти пообещали митингующим, если они разойдутся, вместе с гражданским обществом создать совместную следственную бригаду в целях объективного расследования этих убийств, в том числе и последующих за ними акций протеста, которых центральная власть называет массовыми беспорядками, то есть обещают провести объективное расследование как убийства этих молодых людей, так и так называемые массовые беспорядки.
After the 4-day protest, the authorities came to an agreement with protesters to include their representatives and representatives from the civil society into the joint investigation team to objectively investigate the killings. And however, the authorities kept referring to the protest, to demonstrations as mass riots. So basically they agreed to investigate the murder, but at the same time they kept labeling the protesters and the peaceful demonstrations as mass riots.
На сегодняшний день следственные органы практически не занимаются расследованием убийства Гульбедина Зиобекова и других людей, а исключительно сконцентрированы на расследовании правонарушений со стороны протестующих.
To date, the investigative authorities practically do not investigate the cases of murder. However, they are fully concentrated on the offenses committed by the protesters.
Вдобавок, на протяжении 2 месяцев устроена настоящая травля населения и очернение участников акций протеста, в том числе и убитых и раненых, называя их преступниками, понесшими заслуженное наказание.
In addition, for almost 2 months, the authorities have been harassing and demonizing the population and the protesters, including those who were assassinated and injured, labeling them as criminals who deserved punishment.
Объявлена охота на активистов бадахшанского происхождения на территории Российской Федерации и других стран, которые так или иначе высказываются критически в отношении силовых структур. Происходит произвольное задержание на территории Российской Федерации с последующим выдворением из этой страны, и которые впоследствии оказываются в тюрьмах Таджикистана.
A hunt has been declared for activists of Badakhshani origin in Russia and other countries who are critical of the security forces in one way or another. Arbitrary detentions are taking place in the territory of Russian Federation with subsequent expulsion from this country and ending up in prisons in Tajikistan.
Один из таких, Чоршанбе, спортсмен, который был депортирован из России 30 декабря, сегодня находится в СИЗО МВД Республики Таджикистан. Другой лидер памирской молодежи Амредин Аловачев, вот уже 17-й день, как исчез в России, и до сих пор неизвестно его местонахождение и жив ли он вообще. Сегодня, да, жив ли он вообще.
One such case is Chorshambiev, who was deported from Russia on December 30th. And today he is in a pre-trial detention facility of the Ministry of Interior of Tajikistan. Another person, a renowned leader of Pamiri youth in Russia, Amridin Alvatshoev, was forcibly was subjected to enforced disappearance in Russia, and it's been the 18th day today that he has disappeared, and nobody knows his whereabouts and whether he is actually alive or not.
Сегодня силовые структуры заставляют работников бюджетной сферы выступать по местному телевидению по заранее приготовленным текстам, в которых в том числе называют имена граждан, называя их главарями преступных группировок Хорога.
Today, the security forces are forcing budgetary employees to speak on local Badakhshan television as per the prepared texts, which they also announce names of certain citizens, labeling them as leaders of criminal gangs in Horog.
Думаю, конфликт вызван, несмотря на то, что у нас своя специфика, то есть этническое и конфессиональное меньшинство, но я думаю, конфликт скорее вызван социальной неустроенностью в первую очередь. Так как Таджикистан в целом по внутреннему валовому продукту на душу населения находится в последней четверке стран азиатского континента, а Бадахшан же самый бедный регион этого Таджикистана.
What actually caused the conflict, I think, despite the specific attributes of the region, I tend to think that the conflict was caused due to certain social unsettlements in the first place. Tajikistan as a whole is in the last 4 countries of the Central Asian continent in terms of GDP per capita, while Badakhshan is the poorest region of Tajikistan.
Дорога, связывающая Бадахшан с центром, и внутренние дороги в Бадахшане в плачевном состоянии. Можно сказать, что у нас нет хороших дорог. В таком случае доставка грузов, продуктов первой необходимости с других регионов Таджикистана в Бадахшан, из центра Хорога до других регионов делает эту продукцию очень дорогой.
The internal roads in the region are in a worst possible condition. It's basically off-road driving toward Horog, and the delivery of goods to this part of the republic becomes very expensive, and from Horog onwards to the distant areas gets even more expensive.
Интернет-связь у нас очень дорогая и с очень низкой скоростью, и Бадахшан часто отключается и от этого очень низкоскоростного интернета, что приводит к большим потерям как в экономике, так и в моральном отношении. Сегодня люди, народ Бадахшана, находящийся за пределами Таджикистана, не могут связываться со своими родственниками, это отцы, матери, со своими детьми, или дети со своими родителями. И это очень морально, очень истощает людей.
Internet communication is very expensive, and the traffic speed is very low, and we are also very often deprived of it. Badakhshan has been without internet for a while, which for almost 2 months now, which has caused huge damage to the economy of the region, as well as in psychological manner when parents could not reach their children. It also psychologically damages people.
В регионе самый высокий уровень безработицы. Проценты по кредитам на несколько процентов выше общереспубликанских показателей. Народ не имеет доступа практически к финансам. Создается впечатление, что область находится в экономической блокаде.
The region has the highest rate of unemployment, and interest rates on loans are several percent higher than the national rates. People don't have access to finances, and thus one gets the impression that the region is in economic blockage.
С 2018 года в области практически не функционирует конституционная власть. Власть передана в руки так называемого межведомственного штаба по наведению порядка, в который входят исключительно силовые структуры. Руководителем данного штаба назначен заместитель министра внутренних дел, и практически вся власть на территории автономии принадлежит этому органу.
Since 2018, there has been virtually no constitutional authority in the region. Power has been placed in the hands of the so-called Interdepartmental Commission on Establishing Law and Order, which includes law enforcement agencies. The Deputy Minister of Interior was appointed as the head of this commission, and practically all authority on the territory of the autonomy belongs to this general.
Выходцы из этого региона практически отчуждены от власти. Исключительным доверием центра здесь обладает ГКМБ. Все решения центр принимает по согласованию с этим органом, вплоть до кадровой политики в области. Председатель области лишь номинально занимает эту должность. В том числе поэтому и продолжает сохраняться напряженность в регионе. Ведь силовые структуры, прокуратура и суды заинтересованы в криминальном имидже региона. Во-первых, увеличивается взяткооблагаемая база, а во-вторых, опыт работы в горячей точке становится хорошим трамплином в карьерном росте.
People from these areas are practically alienated from power. State Committee for National Security has an exclusive trust of the center. All decisions of the center are made in coordination with this body. Even the personnel policy, the human resources policy in the region. The chairman of the region only nominally occupies his position. And this is one of the reasons why there is still tension in the region. Power structures, prosecutor's office and courts are interested in criminal image of the region. Firstly, it increases the so-called bribe-taking base. And secondly, the experience of working in a hotspot like Badakhshan becomes for those persons a good springboard for career growth.
Я хотел в дальнейшем рассказать, к сожалению, я сам не по-английски выступил, не на английском. И я бы хотел в дальнейшем сказать о причинах такого противостояния центра с регионом, но поскольку формат нашей встречи не дает такой возможности, так будет очень долго с переводом. Поэтому, наверное, здесь остановлюсь.
I intended initially to talk about the reasons of such confrontation between the center and the autonomy, but since the format of our session does not allow this, I think it would be best to stop right here.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Sherzamanov, and the translator. We'll come back to these other issues, but I want to move now to Dr. Levy-Sanchez. Susie, if I may, you have worked in this region that Mr. Sherzamanov has been describing, and I wonder if you could tell us your impressions of what's going on there and how you think the region's history during the Civil War and its geographical location play into the politics of clampdown, basically, that the region has been suffering.
Thank you for the question, and it's an honor to be here today. You know, I feel humbled to be in this group and to have Alim, who knows the region much better than I do, here in company with me. But I think I have a different, or maybe an outsider's perspective. The last time I was there, just to be clear, was the end of 2015. And it was a much different place at that time. So I'm going to briefly go through my interpretation of sort of the history from the Civil War and then into today. So during the time of the Civil War, as there was or maybe right at the sort of 1993-ish, 94, there was what some would say a genocide against the Pamiris and the Garmis in the country. And then they had to, there was also economic warfare that caused mass hunger and starvation in the region and a cutoff of the region. And that was used to get the area under control. And then there was a group of commanders that developed during that time to work with the people. And they also worked across border to get weapons and whatnot to both try to get supplies as well as fight the government. And so that occurred. And then the peace accords, which people have talked about, in the 16th session that occurred, and the settled negotiated agreement was supposed to allow Gorno-Badakhshan to still have semi-autonomy as a region, which it had had during the Soviet period, as well as participation in the government, which did not occur. And this semi-autonomy for the region has been a contentious issue ever since. And as President Rahmon has tried to consolidate power more and more throughout the region, he has managed in various areas that were a little bit autonomous to clamp down, kill local leaders, and then gain control. And he has now continued to try to do that in Gorno-Badakhshan. And in 2012, there was a conflict, 2014, 2018, and now today. And since 2018, I think it's gotten significantly worse. So, you know, in 2012, in my opinion, it was largely over control over the economy of the area and competition over the drug trade and other, there were some other shenanigans underneath as well. 2014, it was the government once again trying to clamp down and killed 2 of the local leaders and then tried to use that as a ruse to get more. During both the 2012 and 2014 conflicts, there were, again, settled agreements between civil society leaders and the government. And the agreements always were, the government said, if you disperse, we will not go after the civil society leaders or the protesters. And the civil society leaders, which were branded as criminals or part of criminal gangs, were actually, most of them were not. In fact, I don't know that any of them were. Some of them had served in the Tajik government. Some had been politicians like Alim. And I think that instead of leaving them alone, they chased many of them out of the country. They put them on lists. There were blacklists. During the 2012 protests, there were pictures of people in the airport on the blacklist. 2014, they went after several of the protesters. And recently in 2020, the same thing happened. So in 2014, there was protesters in the main square that had camped out for 12 days. And the government threatened if they did not disperse, they would shoot into the group. So Commander Bakir came out and he said, along with the civil society leaders, and said, we've come to a settled agreement, you need to disperse now. But the government did not follow through on any of the agreements. Come to 2020, this time they actually did shoot into the crowd, as people had feared would be kind of like an Andijan, in Uzbekistan. And I think they promised once again that they would investigate the who murdered Gulbuddin Ziobekov, and they promised they would restore internet, and they promised to not go after the protesters. This time, different from last time, they've actually gone after more of the civil society leaders as well as the commanders, and they've even then gone, and the Pamiris in Khorog have gotten support from both neighboring districts as well as from Moscow. And so I think that there was a thought that they had some safe passage or safe space in Moscow, which has turned out not to be true, because Amri Din in many ways had united the youth there to help protest against what was going on in Khorog. And now he's been kidnapped basically, or arrested at the border of Ukraine and silenced. So bringing it into today, I think that right now, from what I've heard, there's competition within the Tajik government for power and control on various levels. And the Pamirs in some ways are being used, or Khorog, as a pawn in that game to an extent. I think the other big challenge for today's conflict that I find very concerning is both China and Russia's role. Russia allegedly has the Wagner group in the former Shurabad area in the hills. I forget the new name, Shaheen Shamsuddin or something, it's the new name. And, but also, China allegedly is building this, funding a new base in Ishkashem, and then it has the base in above Morgab. And it is allegedly doing joint trainings as Russia is. And I think the fear there is that both Putin and Xi Jinping are supporting the authoritarian regime, and there is a desire to gain control of what President Ramon keeps saying are these criminal gangs and these hooligans, and they're going to join with Jamaat Ansarullah and become Islamic extremists, which, is, of course, there is not. And then recently, a few days ago, His Highness the Aga Khan actually came out in support of peace in the region and asked the people to respect peace and to not engage in rumor or fighting, etc. And in his talk, I suspect that he had a conversation potentially with the president of Tajikistan, and but I don't know that, and that there may have been some kind of negotiated something. And so for now, there might not be the military incursion that many have feared, but others fear that the KGB is not in the region, is not, or the GKNB is not completely in line with the current government. So it's hard to say what will happen. I mean, I think lastly, the Afghan side of the border that plays into this, I don't think that the Afghan side of the border per se and the Taliban government is any actual real danger to Tajikistan at this point, but that clearly does not stop Russia, China, and the Tajik government from stating that it is and using it and exaggerating what is there and what is going on. I think I'm going to leave it there.
No, thank you very much. That really is fascinating. You know, what you say about the Aga Khan's possible negotiations with the government. And of course, in a way, that's a kind of repetition of what had happened earlier on in the last days of the Civil War. And it seemed to have held the peace for a bit, but was gradually, as you yourself described it, winnowed away. So it's not clear whether future negotiations will do anything more than, hold an ever more precarious peace. The other thing you mentioned, which is really fascinating, of course, is the internationalization of the conflict. And in the 90s, it was not internationalized, at least not in the same way. Yeah, a little bit. Of course, that was those were the last days of the Taliban in their first incarnation in Afghanistan. Now they're back. Right. So there's a strange logic of repetition here going on. But of course, I suppose the big difference is that today, unlike in the 90s, you have, relatively speaking, an extensive Pamiri diaspora in many parts of the world. That always existed in Russia. Perhaps they're even more in Russia than they were at the time. And we see that they actually take to the streets and protest in front of Tajik embassies in different parts of the world, in the EU, in the US, etc. So it's difficult to keep that genie in the bottle again.
That's right.
So I wonder, if you could say something about the combination of these two things, that there's now vocal and relatively youthful diaspora internationally. And secondly, that the international situation, you mentioned Russia, China, etc., has, on the one hand, it seems to, as you say, support the government's view on Badakhshan. On the other hand, one wonders if there's any possibility of the internationalization of the region going in another direction. And I want to bring Ed in on this as well later. And then, of course, Mr. Sherzamanov and Mr. Kaberi on whether it might be possible, as happened in the past, when there was, conceived to be a special relationship between the Pamiris and Russia, that, is Russia always likely to side with the government, or might it also be interested in assuming the role of a mediator to deal with this conflict? I mean, that's an entirely open question, but perhaps if you can, Susie, just say something about the novelty of the current situation with the diaspora and etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's several layers, right? The Pamiris in Moscow, particularly under Amridin, Aletshoyev, had grown more powerful. And I think that from what I understand, talking to various people, that this is going to continue, and that there's a pretty active group there that is organizing. And I also had heard when the phone lines were cut in the area that some of the Pamiris had coordinated with those in Moscow to begin to send supplies, medical, food, etc., to the area in case they cut it off completely. So I think that diaspora is very strong. I also think there's the diaspora, which is within the larger academic community in the UK and Canada, US, Germany, and there's various activists and scholars from the region, as well as from Tajikistan, like Kabiri's position and Alim's and those people have strong voices, and they're not going to just let it go. And they also have some protection, but they're also at the same time at great risk. Obviously, we had the killing in the streets in Turkey, and this recent kidnapping of a couple of leaders. So that's one thing. The other thing is, will Russia provide a mediation role? I'm going to read the tea leaves because I have no idea, but I think that it's possible for sure. I think that Russia has often almost played both against the other to have control in the region. And while that's a negative, it could become a positive in the sense that they want to have more control, and so they're not going to give over to one or the other completely. And they also want to have a say in what some of the trade coming out of Afghanistan, I think is also part of it. So they have to work both with the Tajik government, but they also don't want to see complete civil unrest, because that would disrupt both the stability in the region as well as the flow of trade and whatnot. So that makes sense. China has very different, I think, goals in the region. It wants stability, it wants complete control, it wants to feel, I mean, in my opinion, it wants to feel like the region is part of its larger outer periphery. It wants to gain control of the mineral resources. And I think it will support the governments, both the Taliban and the government of Tajikistan, to get the amount of stability it needs to be able to get the resources it wants. And I think it will do that by any means necessary, in my opinion, given how the Uyghurs are being treated. And I think the fear of the fear of some kind of translation of the Uyghur situation into the Pamiris, depending on the influence of China, I don't think is completely ill-founded, but I also think it's almost impossible there. And the last thing I'll say about that is the Aga Khan, his influence, as well as the Aga Khan Development Network institutions in the region, provide a balance to the authoritarian cloud that covers the region. And I do think many in the region are scared that this will be chased out because the authoritarian dictators don't want that influence in the region. On the other hand, it provides an infusion of stability and funding and development to the region that nobody else is providing. And it would cause instability at the border if they were to be rid of that. I hope that, I'm sorry if I rambled.
No, I think that's, that's very interesting. So in a way, so much depends upon what happens in Afghanistan, US policy towards the new Taliban government, and what the Chinese and Russians do there, because that's the border that, of course, directly abuts Badakhshan. So it really is inevitably an international situation now, and AKDN plays this curious role of being both, as it were, inciting the suspicions of the government, and while at the same time trying to tamp down on any civil society protests, and therefore, strangely seems to represent both the government on the one hand and civil society on the other, which is an impossible role for any NGO to play. But can I move on to Mr. Kabiri on this very question of Russian intervention and mediation? Sorry.
Could I just add one tiny thing to the AKDN situation, one sentence, which is, I think there's a split inside. The ones who support the government and the ones who are trying to maintain neutrality. And that's been a struggle for a while.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Mr. Kabiri, your thoughts on Russia and whether you have any interactions with them on this matter?
Thank you, Faisal. Yeah, I fully agree with Susan, what she said already about Russia's role. I want to add that Russia is not interested yet in a new conflict in post-Soviet area. After Kazakhstan, Belarus, Ukraine, a new conflict in Tajikistan. And I think that it is too much for for Russia to be everywhere with troops as mediator, or for example, in Kazakhstan, there wasn't any mediation. There was direct troop operation, so it will be very difficult to control all situation in our region. But it doesn't mean that there are not any cooperation between Russia and Tajikistan on Pamiris or on Pamir's activists. You know, these two cases with Chorshambiyev and Amridin shows us that there are very good tight cooperation between security borders from Tajikistan and Russia. Without Russians intelligence service or the police, Tajik government could not kidnap both and to deport to Tajikistan. So I think that Russia played now two games. One, very good cooperation with the Tajik government on security and against all activist opposition groups. And same time, Russia will keep stability in the region. And let us not to forget that Russia, Badakhshan and Russia, it's very unique and specific question, because before in Emirate period, before Bolsheviks, Russian emperor had limited troops, military groups in Badakhshan. So many of Russian experts till now speaking about this historical moment. So I think that, but Russia, I'm not sure that Russia can play the role of moderator of to bring both sides to the table, because Rahmon is not ready to any third party to be involved in Tajik questions now.
Thank you very much. Yes, no, it's a series of conundrums, isn't it? You know, what can and cannot be done. You know, the paradox is, on the one hand, the Rahmon government cannot survive, as you say, without Russian support. On the other hand, the Russians are unable to actually impose themselves, or perhaps unwilling to impose themselves on Tajikistan, perhaps unless the situation in Afghanistan warrants it. Ed, what do you think? Do you have any view on this sort of larger international dimension of the conflict?
I think Russia would, if it had to intervene in a conflict in Horog, if it was a conflict between the local population and the government, it would be in a difficult position. I think Russia remains popular in the country for the most part, especially amongst Pamiris, as Suzanne said. And if Russia was seen to be intervening against the Tajik population, I think that would, you know, present it with challenges going forward. I think Russia is more likely to intervene in the case of a spillover of terrorism from Afghanistan. And certainly there were fears at the time of the recent situation in Kazakhstan, that there would be a similar operation in Horog, that the government would, you know, effectively launch some sort of provocation. They would frame the incident as being a spillover from Afghanistan, and then they would call on their international partners to intervene. You know, I think that obviously hasn't happened, but I think, you know, unless it was framed as some sort of spillover from Afghanistan, I think Russia would struggle to justify its intervention in what could be framed as a domestic dispute.
No, thanks. I mean, one wonders also, going back to what Mr. Sherbaz-Zamanov was saying earlier, about, you know, how much air is left in this narrative of Islamic militancy, given the decline of the kind of war on terror and the strange happenings in Afghanistan, where the Taliban now are to be, or I assume will be recognized as a government. In any case, there are negotiations with all kinds of powers, including the United States. So what seemed to have worked after 9/11 to label both the Renaissance Party as an Islamist party, which is laughable, of course, but also to gesture towards Afghanistan and what was happening there and the commanders that Susie was speaking about. You know, I don't know, I'm sure many people didn't believe any of it in the region, but I wonder how believable any of this is internationally any longer either. So, you know, one wonders if there's a new narrative that's necessary, or maybe there isn't. You know, maybe the government will just soldier on with what it has, and it doesn't matter.
I think if recent events in Kazakhstan are anything to go by, where the government blamed the unrest on 20,000 terrorists, foreign-sponsored terrorists, that was how they obviously legitimized the Collective Security Treaty Organization intervening with their peacekeeping forces. You know, at least Russia and China in their posturing and their narrative, you know, very much publicly bought into that, at least, and reaffirmed it. Whether, as you say, they actually believe that, or whether the people on the ground in these countries believe it as well, is probably less likely. But certainly it seems that outwardly, at least, the two great powers on the borders of the region, Russia and China, are happy to continue to tow this narrative of extremists and terrorist threat. And we've seen the government, you know, governments throughout the region continuing to use this specter of terrorism and extremism to legitimize various arrests and clampdowns on opposition. So certainly we're seeing the continued politicization of counter-extremism. I wouldn't think it's going to go away anytime soon.
Yes, of course, you're right. And the Chinese also do that in Xinjiang, you know, Susie was mentioning. We have a question, Till Mostolansky, would you like to ask it in person, or do you want me to read it out? Okay, I will read it out since I don't hear from you. So thanks to all speakers. I have a question to the Badakhshan experts. What is your interpretation of Yodgor Faizov's dismissal as governor of Gorno-Badakhshan? I have heard contacts in the region talk about his impending political comeback. Others have referred to his dismissal as final and perhaps a reappearance in the Aga Khan institutions. I would appreciate your opinion on this. Many thanks. So shall we begin with Mr. Sherzamanov and then move on to your comments, Susie?
I think I should interpret the question to Alim, and then he would
yes, please
respond. Алим Тил Мостоланский спрашивает, как бы вы объяснили уход Йодгора Файзова из поста председателя Горного Бадахшана? Он слышал, что есть слухи, что он, возможно, вернется в политику. По другим слухам, возможно, он уже окончательно ушел из политики, и, возможно, он начнет работу заново в институтах Ага Хана. Как вы думаете по этому поводу?
Вернется в политику Йодгор Файзов, это вернется тот, кто был в политике. Йодгор Файзов не был никогда в политике.
It's a controversy for. It's a little controversial. A person can return to politics if he was actually in politics, but in case of Yodgor Faizov, he wasn't part of the politics at all. He was just appointed as a figure which didn't really decide anything.
Он был функционером, и когда власти, центральные власти с 2006 года до сегодня ищут силового решения проблемы Хорога.
The central government is trying to find a forcible way of solving the problems in Horog and in Gorno-Badakhshan. since 2006.
И в том числе в 2018 году, когда в течение 3 лет, с 15 до 18 года, так же, как сегодня, чернили нас по всем средствам массовой информации силовой структуры.
So, and in the same manner as it was in 2015 to 2018, for this specific period of 3 years, we have been demonized by the central government and law enforcement.
И по приезду Рахмона в Харог он потребовал с применением вооруженных сил навести порядок в Хароге.
When President Rahmon arrived in Horog in 2018, he officially demanded from the law enforcement with the use of power to settle things down.
И в тот момент какие-то советники Рахмона посоветовали ему, оценили ситуацию и пришли к мнению, что еще не время, то есть еще нет достаточно, то есть еще нет достаточной, то есть народ в целом, целый народ еще не приемлет центр так, как, то есть нет еще доверия к центру и доверия к силовым структурам настолько, чтобы они могли более безболезненно, чем в 2012 году, решить проблему силовым методом.
Back then, someone from his advisors apparently assessed the situation and advised him that this is not a favorable moment for us, since the people I mean, they do not really trust in the government and in law enforcement, and it might not end up in a favorable way that we actually want to.
И тут остался Йодгор Файзов как последний, как бы вам сказать, то есть последним рычагом завоевывания доверия населения, основной части населения, к центральной власти. То есть Йодгор Файзов был назначен лишь для того, чтобы подготовить почву для следующего этапа силовой операции, если вот так сказать. То есть отделить основную массу народа от так называемых преступников.
So in this moment, Yudgor Faizov was basically used as a tool in order to win the trust of the general public toward the central government. So he was used to divide the general masses from the so-called criminal gangs.
И они к 2021 году, через 3 года, они решили, что он с этой задачей справился, то есть уже можно безболезненно решить проблему силовыми методами, и до сих пор они верят по их сегодняшним шагам, которые они предпринимают в очернении определенной группы населения, еще они уверены, что то есть время пришло, то есть нужно решить эту проблему раз и навсегда.
So since his appointment in 2018, and now it's been 3 years, and the government decided that now it's a high time to basically take on the military resolution of the problem in Gorno-Badakhshan. He was dismissed, and apparently those in the government still believe that it's a good decision, and they keep demonizing a certain portion of the public and keep using the force in order to solve the problems.
Они решили, что они не нуждаются уже в том, в имидже хорошей власти для региона. Для них уже это, они почувствовали, что этой необходимости больше нет, и они могут силовыми методами заставить и навести свой не порядок государственный, а свой порядок, который наведен во всей республике, но от случая к случаю в Хароге встречается проблема.
So the government basically decided that they no more need this image of a just and good government, and they can use the power in order to put in place the order that they need, which is contrary to the order of the state as per the constitution and other norms. The order that they managed to put in place in other regions of Tajikistan, but in Gorno-Badakhshan, from time to time, they still face some resistance.
И вот они решили, что не нуждаются больше в услугах Йодгора Файзова. А что касается возвращения Йодгора Файзова или прихода Йодгора Файзова к политике, это возможно только если он захочет стать оппозиционером. В ином амплуа он не может просто войти в политику. Ему не дадут войти.
In terms of Yodgor Faizov's return to politics, he can actually do that only in one case, if he would join the oppositionist forces. In other cases, there will be no other chances for him.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting set of comments. I want to turn to you, Susie, for your views. You know, what Mr. Shahzamanov has been saying is displays what you had suggested earlier, the internal cleavages within, whether it's the AKDN or civil society. I had heard that there'd even been an approach from people in the Pamirs to the president's son, who is mayor, as Ed tells us, of Dushanbe. You know, so there seems to be an attempt to play off factions within the government itself. So your factions on all sides of this fence. You know, what do you think is happening on this very particular question that Till has asked? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out which parts to add in here. Alim gave a very fulsome answer. I think Yodgar Faizov, I completely agree with Alim, was more of a puppet or figurehead. I think that the government, from his embezzlement, his issues prior, from his prior position, they kind of had a complete hold over him. So he was a perfect governor to have in place. The current acting governor of Gorno-Badakhshan, former General Mirza Nabatov, is a disciple, from what I understand, of Yatimov. And that's where I think the internal split becomes important. And the problem is, my information about the internal split is largely based on conjecture, rumor, etc. So I go into my discussion of this with that caveat that I don't have enough information, but I do think it's important to understand it. I think there's from what I understand, the president's family was trying to push Yatimov out. Yatimov was not going to be pushed out and has his own power. In fact, from what I understand, he has his own network connections to Russia and China. So he has some outside support. And he how do I put this? There was also some competition over the illicit trade networks. And Yatimov caused some problems along those networks in order to show that he still had some authority. And from what I understand, that was also part of the reason of getting Faizov out, so that the prosecutor could go in, cause sort of a conflict in Khorog, and distract from the issue of getting rid of Yatimov, if I'm making sense here. And what that did, from what I understand, is actually unite Azada, the daughter, and the mayor, Rustam, a little more, and against Yatimov, whereas they were not as united before, and Rustam Ali may have been a little more of someone to go to. I hadn't heard that the Pamiris had gone to him, but I can understand that. So I guess overall, when I look at the picture, Faizov was used as a puppet. They put in someone else to have an excuse to say, now we're going to go after this guy, which caused a conflict. It actually strengthened Yatimov's position, which was weakened. It united parts of the Tajik family. And then now it's hard to say where that competition is going. Again, conjecture, rumor. And where Faizov, whether he's coming back or not, will depend on, there was a recent meeting with Faizov, Daler Jamayev's brother, and the Tajik government about Gorno-Badakhshan and about getting rid of these criminal leaders. So Faizov is, along with Daler Jamayev, are deeply in that camp. And so I suppose it just depends on where Yadgar Faizov's usefulness at this point would be. And I think Alim's point that if he's going to have any legitimacy in terms of Badakhshan at all, I completely agree that he'd have to join the opposition, but that would be pretty tricky for him.
Thank you very much. So in the few minutes left, if anyone has any questions, please write it in the Q&A box or raise your hand and I will call upon you should you want to speak. This discussion as it has proceeded, it's very interesting because it shows us where all the kind of doors of, as it were, constitutional dissent are shut. Opposition seems to move into families and operate through factions and through instrumentalization of various factions. So it never entirely goes away. It's, as it were, internalized and fragments groups from within. And, Susie, one of the things you just mentioned now is it seems to be the major force that allows all of these factional relations to splinter or to come together. And that is the democratic civil society on the street kinds of demonstrations that we see in Khorog, which are extraordinary as far as I know.
Yeah.
You don't see them much in post-Soviet space. And they have been going on for a while, for years now.
Yeah.
People manage to come together. They cut down trees to stop, armored vehicles and all the rest. In a society which itself otherwise seems to be quite factionalized by neighborhood and language and all the rest, where is this tradition coming from? It really is entirely extraordinary, and one reason why I tend myself personally to deprecate calls to let's not demonstrate and maybe things will get better is that, well, then I agree with you, I don't think they will get better, but also the demonstration allows for the splintering, fragmentation, and kaleidoscopic remaking of relations all across the country. And that's really something that you don't see anywhere else in the country, as far as I know. So, perhaps you can say something briefly about that. And I want to turn to Mr. Kabiri to respond to this as well.
Yeah, I think it is remarkable. I mean, I've written about what I call the informal organizations extensively, but I think in Khorog, they continually remake themselves with a courage and a veracity, despite the crackdowns. And the civil society leaders, in combination with the diaspora, in combination with the commanders and the people, within the community, whether it's within the different mahallas, which is in the educational community, within these sort of under groups within the AKDN, and they do all come together. And you're right, the factionalism goes down to, little fights between street leaders. But when it comes to this, all those factions, they transcend all of that. And they have these demonstrations, which I agree is, it's a form of civil society and public engagement that you wouldn't see in an authoritarian dictatorship. And they're forcing almost a democratization of the public sphere, regardless of the risk. I think it's pretty profound in a region where look at what happened in Kazakhstan. People protested and they brought in Russia and the CSTO and everything else. It's not like Tajikistan doesn't do that, but the people continue. I hope that answered your question.
No, thank you. Mr. Kabiri, do you think that the model of civil society resistance that you see in the Pamirs is impossible in other parts of the country for various reasons, because they are low-lying and they are much easier to get to and much easier to control? Or do you think, what happens in the Pamirs might have some influence in Khatlon or in Gharm or in other parts of the country?
Faisal, I'm not sure that what happens in Kharov, in Pamir now, or for some couple of years, will have soon in another parts of Tajikistan, in Khatlon, in Sogo, Dushanbe. I'm not sure, but it's first time that all Tajiks from Dushanbe, Sogt, Kulyab, and Khatlon, even from migration diasporas, all of these people, the first time they were behind or together with Pamiris in this last events, in November and December. I think that it is a very important signal that before was the problem of Pamiris is the problems, Pamiris. Problem of IRPT, it's the problem of IRPT. Or another secular parties. Zai Saidov was in prison. All of the parties, groups said, okay, it is a problem of Zai Saidov. Even in 2012, 2014, the same problems in Kharov was not so important for Dushanbe, for IRPTU, for another opposition groups. But now the situation is changed. We can discuss why, what is the main factors, but the fact is that all opposition groups, all migrants, and a lot of people in Dushanbe, in Sogt, they are trying to show their sympathy, their support, moral support toward Pamiris and Badakhshan. So I think it is a very important thing. Yeah.
That really is, no, that's hugely consequential. I entirely agree. Ed, perhaps you can say something about the effect or non-effect of what's happening in the Pamirs and other parts of the country, and whether you see the possibility or the desire for, if you will, more democratic governance in terms of organization in these different parts of the country.
I think the grievances are certainly there. We've had decades of misrule, authoritarian governments, widespread corruption, and we've occasionally seen it spilling over into protests, small-scale protests. There was a protest in 2020 after I think it was a mudslide and the lack of government response in Khatlon province. We've seen very occasionally, mostly in the Pamir, people mobilizing against the government. I think there's still this association in people's minds, and I think even though now most people in the country don't have a living memory of this, the majority of the population born since independence, but there is still this repeated, which Muhuddin mentioned in his opening remarks, repeated idea that if you protest that inevitably leads to instability. Look at what happened with the Arab Spring in Syria. Look at what happened in Tajikistan in 1992, where we had two opposing protests eventually turning violent and leading to a civil war. So I think there's still this attempt by the government to cultivate this idea that politics and engagement in politics is dangerous, right? And that citizens should be anti-political. They should associate politics with violence. And so I think that's been relatively successful. But as we've seen throughout history, if these grievances are there, they can often explode in ways that we wouldn't predict. So I think there's certainly the potential there. But at this point, we've seen the Tajik people being very resilient, very patient, putting up with a lot of hardships. And so it may well be that they continue this quietist approach. So I think there's potential, but I would say it's unlikely that we'll see mass protests anytime soon. And if we are to see protests, Horog and the Pamir is the most likely place.
Thank you very much, Ed. Perhaps we should end with Mr. Sherzamanov. Given what has been happening in Horog and in the Pamirs, perhaps you can say something about what you expect to happen and what you would like to happen within the realm of the possible. And maybe we should have the translator translate this first.
Yes. Учитывая то, что произошло в Хороге в ноябре, декабре, вот то, что сейчас происходит, как, по вашему мнению, что далее будет происходить, или же что бы вы хотели, чтобы произошло, как бы вы, ваш сценарий, как бы вам хотелось?
Так, мне бы хотелось, чтобы у нас было демократическое устройство государства, при котором такие национальные, этнические, другие меньшинства могут себя чувствовать свободно только при демократических режимах. Никогда, ни при одном тоталитарном режиме меньшинство не может себя чувствовать в безопасности. Это то, что я...
What I would like to have is a genuine democratic structure, genuine democratic regime where all the national, ethnic, linguistic, religious minorities could subsist freely, which is pretty impossible in any totalitarian or autocratic regimes that we are right now in. That's what I want.
Что касается ситуации, вот в данной ситуации, небывалые с 92 года, сейчас небывалое единение, как в Бадахшане, так и вне Бадахшана, как бы поддержка бадахшанцев.
What is currently happening is that it's an unprecedented, since 1992, we see an unprecedented consolidation of the society, both within Badakhshan itself and outside the support for the Badakhshanis.
И в данной ситуации они не решатся на крайние меры, я думаю, но вот это с сохранением этого режима, который сейчас существует, с сохранением этого режима, вот эта ситуация не будет улучшаться. Смотрите, там идет борьба за ресурсы. У нас нет свободных, у нас нет нефти, долларов, у нас нет газа, у нас нет таких вот ресурсов, где бы эти чиновники, которые в Казахстане, в России, в Арабских Эмиратах делают деньги. Наши делают деньги по коррупционным схемам, И вот смотрите, последние с 2006 года, когда подписаны между АКДН и правительством эти соглашения о вливании в экономику и о вливании в Бадахшан, начинается проблема на Бадахшане. Потому что чиновники с центра не хотят там проблемы, они хотят там заработать. Они хотят, чтобы вот все эти миллионы проходили через них. И чтобы никто им не мешал. И это будет только продолжаться. И чем больше капиталовложений в Бадахшан, тем больше будет конфликт.
Under the current circumstances, it is unlikely that the government would take extreme measures. However, with the preservation of the current regime, the tension will remain, since the region does not have any oil or gas or any other resources that could be easily extracted and benefited from. I have noticed that since 2006, when the AKDN structure started to invest in the region, and there were some substantial capital investments, the interest of the center toward the autonomy started to grow. And nowadays, those authorities are trying to keep the inflow of investments under their control, so that all those millions would go through their hands and they would, to a certain extent, benefit from them.
Thank you very much. I mean, at the very end of our session, all of these new issues come up. It's always the case, isn't it? So on the one hand, you have the poorest region of the country, which yet is capable of being a cash cow, both through the drug trade through Afghanistan, but also through monies received by NGOs and all the rest. We also have, I noticed from the chat, the sort of, if you will, the international recognition of kleptocracy with the possible appointment of the president's daughter as ambassador to the UK. I don't know if this has happened yet or not.
It has. Yeah.
Oh dear. And the appointment of a new AKF leader as well, as Susie has written. So all kinds of things are happening. Not very cheery news, unfortunately, but nevertheless quite different from the 1990s insofar as we are now talking about a situation which cannot just be confined and closed off altogether. There is so much more of everything. Violence, not of the genocidal kind that perhaps we saw in the early 1990s, but more structured kind by the state, diaspora, possible international interest, or certainly internationalization, which of course always brings in the possibility of proxy wars. Perhaps this is not a region, the Pamirs, or even indeed Tajikistan, where that could happen very easily. But a whole range of issues yet to be discussed. And I hope we can have another couple of sessions in coming weeks on Tajikistan, not only because of its own problems and possibilities, but also because in some ways it tells us about the region, Central Asia as a whole, and the post-Soviet space as a whole. Thank you very much indeed to all our panelists today. It really has been a wonderfully informative session. I have kept you very long, but my gratitude and my thanks. The session will be recorded, it'll be put online, and you will all receive links to it. So with that, and my best wishes for the future stability and peace of Gorno-Badakhshan and of Tajikistan as a whole. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much, Faisal.
Thank you.
Susan.
Thank you.
Edward.
Really, it's a pleasure seeing everybody, an honor to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye bye.